It began with the silence of defeat. Cities once echoing with Mussolini's speeches now lay quiet. Broken walls, collapsed roofs, and the smell of burned history. In 1943, Italy's collapse shattered not only its military, but the lives of countless women who were left behind in a war that suddenly no longer belonged to them. When Italy surrendered to the Allies, the Germans, once their allies, turned from partners into predators. Italian women, who had once waved flags for victory parades, now hid in basements afraid of the footsteps that marched past their shattered homes. What happened to them in those months was something no official report ever recorded in full, but fragments survived. In diaries, in fading photographs, and in the trembling voices of those who lived long enough to whisper what they saw. In the shadowed alleys of Rome, in the rubble of Naples, and across the countryside, women became the currency of revenge. To the German soldiers, betrayal was unforgivable. They saw Italy's surrender as treason, a knife to the back of the Reich. Every Italian woman was now a potential enemy, a symbol of that betrayal. Some were accused of harboring partisans, others were simply in the wrong place when the trucks arrived. Soldiers would storm through villages shouting for collaborators. But what followed was rarely about politics. Women were dragged from their homes, lined up in squares, their hair shorn as soldiers jeered. In the eyes of the occupiers, humiliation was discipline, but for many humiliation was only the beginning. There are photographs, blurry, grainy, taken in secret, that show lines of women with hollow eyes, standing before barns or trucks, guarded by men with rifles. They were interrogated, the report said. Yet what those reports omit is the terror behind those closed barn doors. In the chaos of the occupation, discipline blurred into cruelty. German officers and fascist loyalists created makeshift prisons. Old schools, warehouses, and cellars turned into places where the cries of women were swallowed by the thick, cold stone. The goal was information, they said, but the war had twisted men into something else entirely. It was no longer about control. It was about power. The Allied bombing raids only worsened their suffering. Villages were cut off, roads destroyed, communication lost. Soldiers moving through these isolated areas found no oversight, no witnesses. In mountain towns of northern Italy, partisan groups fought German patrols in brutal skirmishes, and whenever a German was killed, the retaliation was immediate. Women were the easiest targets. Per una vita 10 vite, the soldiers would say. For one life, 10 lives. Some were shot, others were spared, but only after being made an example. One survivor from Emilia-Romagna recalled hiding beneath floorboards as her mother was taken by soldiers. She never saw her again. When the war ended, the village found her body near a river, her hands bound, her eyes still open. And yet, there were other horrors less visible but equally haunting. The women taken alive were often forced to serve the soldiers, not as prisoners, but as tools. German command posts across Italy, especially near the Gothic line, began to fill with young women captured from nearby towns. They cooked, cleaned, and were made to entertain the officers. Some were barely 16. When liberation came months later, many of them didn't dare return home. To be seen was to be shamed, the villagers whispered. They were called traitors, collaborators, German lovers. Few asked what they had endured to survive. Even among the Allied forces, the Italian women found no safety. In the confusion of liberation, American, British, and French colonial troops entered cities already stripped of order. To the women, they were supposed to be saviors. But for some, salvation came with a price. Reports from Naples and Rome tell of women assaulted by soldiers drunk on victory. The irony was cruel. First betrayed by allies, then by liberators. Some women fled into convents, cutting their hair and taking false names, praying the war would forget them. But the war does not forget. It imprints itself into the faces of those who live through it. The stories that survived did so by accident. An Italian nurse named Lydia Ferri wrote secretly in her journal about what she witnessed in a makeshift hospital near Frosinone. She described women arriving bloodied, trembling, unable to speak. The Germans called them Banditenweiber, women of bandits. They were treated worse than the wounded soldiers. Some were dumped outside the hospitals at night, left to die quietly so no report would have to be filed. Lydia wrote, "Their bodies were war trophies, their souls unrecorded casualties." Her journal, hidden in a wall, was found years later by her grandson. As German control tightened, So did their reprisals. In small towns like Sant'Anna di Stasima and Marzabotto, massacres were carried out against civilians suspected of helping the resistance. Women and children were rounded up, their screams echoing through olive groves. The soldiers often burned the bodies to erase what they had done. But ashes tell their own stories. The ground, decades later, still holds traces of those fires. Locals say that after the war, dogs would dig in the soil and bring up fragments of bone. There were also moments of strange mercy, fleeting, uncertain, almost ghost-like. A German medic who deserted his unit near Florence claimed in a post-war confession that he helped 2 Italian women escape from a military outpost where officers interrogated prisoners nightly. He said they were no longer human, only shadows who forgot how to cry. His words would never be verified, but they offer a glimpse into the fractured morality of a collapsing army, men who could not decide whether they were conquerors or survivors themselves. What remains most haunting is not the violence itself, but the silence that followed. After 1945, Italy chose to rebuild, to forget. Women who had suffered kept their stories buried under decades of shame. In official records, their names rarely appear. They were written off as civilian losses, nothing more. But the whispers endured, in kitchens, in church confessions, in old women's eyes when they looked at photographs of the war. The truth stayed locked inside them, waiting for someone to ask. And perhaps that is the cruelest legacy of all, that so many who endured the darkness were never believed. That in the ruins of fascism, justice was a rumor. The soldiers who had done these things returned home or vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. A few were tried, few were convicted, most carried on as if nothing had happened. The women carried it differently, inside, in silence. But every so often a photograph surfaces, a blurred image of a woman staring directly at the lens, her face bruised, her clothes torn, yet her eyes defiant. No caption, no name. Only a year, 1944. It's as if the war left behind ghosts in black and white, daring us to remember what they were never allowed to say aloud. And this is only the beginning, because what happened in those occupied zones of Italy was far larger, far darker, than any single survivor's story could hold. What the soldiers did next, how they used fear as a weapon, how they built entire systems of silence around their crimes, would reveal the most disturbing truth of all. The truth that power once given to men in war never stops at the battlefield. It follows them home, and in the next chapter of this story we uncover how far that darkness truly reached. The war had split Italy in half, not just on the map, but in its soul. To the north lay the puppet state of Salo, where the last loyal fascists clung to Hitler's promise of order. To the south, the Allies advanced through ruins and graves. Between them, in the broken spine of the Apennines, lay a world with no rules. It was here, in this fractured no-man's land, that the hidden suffering of Italian women deepened into something beyond cruelty. The German forces, desperate to crush resistance and terrified of betrayal, turned entire villages into laboratories of punishment. Every rumor of a partisan fighter brought death. Every whisper of defiance became an excuse for what they called disciplinary action. But beneath those orders, something darker was unfolding. An unrecorded war against women, waged in shadows, away from the headlines of history. It began quietly, a single knock at the door after sunset, a patrol demanding information. A woman taken for questioning and never returning. The soldiers no longer needed reasons, they only needed examples. The more they feared rebellion, the more they needed to show what happened to those who stood against them. In Tuscany, Emilia, and Lombardy, women became both witnesses and warnings. German command posts filled with their screams, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and diesel. What was once a simple arrest turned into ritualized violence, humiliation as deterrence. They were forced to watch others suffer before it was their turn, to teach them silence before it was demanded. Sometimes the cruelty was disguised as control. In Verona, one SS officer ordered the rounding up of all women whose husbands were suspected partisans. They were to be interviewed, he said, with precision and purpose. The reports that survived mention only questioning under pressure. But survivors later described what those words truly meant. Hours of beatings, degradation, and a perverse fascination with breaking not just the body, but the spirit. The soldiers no longer saw human beings before them. They saw symbols of weakness, of treason, of what they had lost in the chaos of a collapsing front. The more they lost on the battlefield, the more savage they became off it. In mountain villages, the scenes bordered on the medieval, cattle barns turned into holding cells, rope marks on beams where people were strung up, women forced to carry German ammunition, clean the soldiers' quarters, and then endure what followed at night. The cold was brutal, but fear was worse. One woman, who later testified before an Allied tribunal, said the soldiers would light cigarettes and press them against the walls, counting down to the next scream from the cell next door. They made silence feel like death, she said. And in that silence, every woman prayed not to be remembered by name, because being remembered meant being chosen next. The Italian fascist militias, who had sworn loyalty to the Germans, joined eagerly in these acts. For them, it was revenge on their own people. Revenge against the betrayal of Mussolini, revenge against the collapse of a dream they once believed in. In towns like Ferrara and Cremona, Italian black brigades worked alongside German units to identify women of the resistance. Some were indeed couriers or nurses for partisan groups. Many were not, but guilt no longer mattered. A single accusation, a rumour whispered by a frightened neighbour, could seal a woman's fate. The collaboration made the horror feel deeper, because now it was not just invaders inflicting pain. It was Italians doing it to Italians. Even when the front lines shifted and Allied bombers thundered overhead, the torment didn't stop. In fact, the chaos gave cover to those who thrived in it. German retreat columns left behind trails of destruction, burned villages, mutilated bodies, and women left naked in fields, their stories erased before they could ever be told. Military records mention retaliatory actions and counterinsurgency measures, but never the word for what it truly was: rape, torture, murder. The crimes were sanitized in ink, buried under layers of bureaucracy. Paper became the clean face of atrocity. But within that darkness, some fought back. Across the hills, Italian partisans began to organize not only for liberation but for vengeance. Women joined them, not only as nurses or messengers but as fighters. Some of them were the very survivors of German violence, driven by the need to strike back at those who had broken them. One such woman, known only by her partisan name Luna, was captured near Bologna after an ambush. She refused to give names even as soldiers beat her for hours. When they realized she would not speak, they paraded her through the village before executing her. Her final words were remembered by a child who watched from a window. "I die for those who will never be found." Those words spread through the hills like a whisper of defiance. Women became the secret spine of the resistance. They smuggled weapons in baskets of bread, passed coded messages through washing lines, and risked everything to hide the hunted. Yet for every act of courage, the punishment grew harsher. German patrols began taking entire families hostage, forcing women to watch their loved ones die before being taken themselves. It was psychological warfare. Break the mothers, and the sons will surrender. But it didn't work. The resistance only grew stronger, fueled by grief and rage. The cost, however, was unbearable. As the Allies approached Florence and the Gothic line, the Germans began destroying everything they could not hold. Bridges, homes, churches, burned to deny the enemy shelter. In the chaos, discipline evaporated completely. Drunken soldiers raided farmhouses at night, taking food, livestock, and women. The hierarchy of command crumbled, and what replaced it was anarchy clothed in uniforms. There are accounts from monks who recorded confessions of soldiers begging forgiveness for what they had done, weeping as they described the faces of the women they had violated. But forgiveness has no place in the ruins of war. Those confessions remained sealed, hidden behind monastery walls, as if the priests themselves feared the truth. The most chilling discovery came years later, when a series of German field reports were uncovered in a military archive in Freiburg. Among them was a short, typewritten memo describing moral measures against subversive Italian elements. The language was vague, but the pattern unmistakable. Each time a partisan cell was destroyed, a village's women disappeared. The number of evacuated civilians matched the number of neutralized threats. It was extermination disguised as procedure, and in that cold, bureaucratic phrasing lay the evidence of how methodical the violence had become. Meanwhile, the outside world remained blind. Allied radio broadcasts celebrated progress and liberation, while Italian newspapers censored anything that might break morale. Even after the war, when trials were held in Rome and Nuremberg, few witnesses spoke of what happened to women. Those who did were often dismissed or silenced. The archives focused on soldiers, generals, and treaties, not on the broken mothers who wandered the roads after liberation searching for daughters taken by retreating troops. History prefers its heroes clean and its victims silent, but silence has a way of decaying. It cracks with time. And through those cracks, fragments of truth began to seep out. Letters, confessions, buried testimonies. They told of officers who ordered entire towns to be cleansed, of women who vanished into German trucks and reappeared only as whispers. Some of those soldiers later lived ordinary lives, fathers, teachers, postmen, never speaking of what they'd done in Italy. The victims, too, lived quietly. They married, had children, smiled for photographs, but deep in their memories, the war never ended. Because what truly happened in those years between 1943 and 1945 wasn't just occupation, it was transformation. The world of moral boundaries collapsed, and in its place rose something primal. The German soldiers weren't born monsters, the war made them so. The Italian collaborators weren't always villains, fear made them choose survival over decency. And the women, those nameless, faceless survivors, became the unspoken witnesses to humanity's fall from grace. Yet even as the smoke cleared and peace was declared, the ghosts of that hidden war remained. Every ruin, every burnt church, every nameless grave whispered the same question: how much of this will ever be remembered? Because the truth was not buried in documents or graves. It lived in the silence of those who saw too much and said nothing. And the silence was about to break, for as the Germans retreated north and the Allies advanced, they left behind evidence, photographs, confessions, survivors. The world would soon glimpse the forbidden face of the occupation, and what it revealed would change how history remembered the war in Italy forever. The winter of 1944 bled into spring with no mercy. Italy was dying slowly, its fields scorched, its cities hollowed, and its people trapped between two advancing storms. The Germans fought to hold the north, the Allies crawled from the south, and between them, ordinary Italians, especially women, became the debris of two collapsing empires. What had once been terror now became routine. German soldiers no longer needed orders to inflict punishment. Cruelty had become instinct, a language they spoke fluently in the ruins. But beneath this mechanical brutality, something deeper began to crack. The line between soldier and savage blurred, and even the perpetrators began to lose their humanity. This was the breaking point, not only for those who suffered, but for those who inflicted the suffering. By early 1945, desperation hung over every German garrison in northern Italy. Hitler's armies were retreating across Europe, and every officer knew the war was lost. But with defeat came madness. The SS units stationed near Brescia, Verona and Bolzano had one last mission: to cleanse the territory of traitors before withdrawal. In practice, this meant annihilating anyone who might rise against them once they left. Whole villages were rounded up, and women bore the heaviest burden of these cleansings. Their homes were searched, their families executed, and their dignity erased in front of their neighbours. Soldiers drank heavily before the raids. It dulled their fear and amplified their cruelty. To them, each scream was proof of control, a way to feel powerful when everything else was slipping away. But power, without purpose, devours itself. One SS corporal, captured months later, confessed to Allied interrogators that he could no longer remember the faces of those he hurt, only the sounds. It was like being buried alive in noise, he said. Every night, the same cries. You stop knowing if they are outside or inside your head. His words echo what survivors later described from the other side, that the men who tortured them seemed empty, moving as if possessed. It was not just a war of occupation anymore, it was the death of reason. The cruelty had become a ritual, a machine feeding on fear. In a small town near Modena, the German command set up what they called a transit facility for suspected resistance supporters. It was little more than a barn with iron bars nailed across the windows. Inside, over 40 women were held in near darkness, many of them wives or daughters of men already executed. Food was scarce, water dirtied with soot. Every night, soldiers entered with flashlights and laughter that didn't sound human. When the Allies reached the area months later, the barn was burned to the ground. Only a few bones were found in the ashes, charred, brittle, unrecognizable. The villagers rebuilt the structure years later as a storehouse, but no one ever used it. They said the air inside never lost its smell. For those who survived captivity, liberation came too late. Their minds had become their prisons, Many refused to speak after the war, unable to put into words what they endured. One woman, taken from her farm near Parma and held by German officers for weeks, later wrote in a private letter, "They took everything except my shadow, and even that I had to hide." That letter was never sent. It was found among her belongings after her death decades later, folded neatly, as if waiting for the world to be ready to listen. The Germans, however, were not the only ones collapsing. Italian fascist collaborators, sensing the Reich's fall, began turning on each other. In their panic to escape retribution, they betrayed comrades, burned documents, and abandoned prisoners. But some sought redemption in blood. They executed partisans, destroyed entire hamlets, and tortured women accused of sleeping with the enemy. The same men who once obeyed German orders now committed atrocities on their own people, hoping to prove their loyalty to a cause already dead. For the women, it meant that there was no longer an oppressor to flee from, only a constant rotation of uniforms and threats. Each faction saw them as symbols of shame, betrayal, or possession. There were moments when the cruelty became almost theatrical. In one documented case from the archives of Milan, a young woman was paraded through the streets wearing a sign that read, "Collaboratrice degli Alleati." Her crime, giving bread to a wounded British soldier. She was beaten, stripped, and her hair cut off as the crowd watched in silence. Some even applauded. The mob's approval gave the soldiers permission to continue. Violence, once confined to dark corners, had become public entertainment. It was no longer about control or revenge, it was about spectacle. And the more desperate the war grew, the more grotesque those spectacles became. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the partisans waged their own brutal war. When they captured German soldiers or Italian fascists, mercy was rare. Many of those executions were witnessed by the very women who had lost their families to the occupiers. Revenge became their language of survival. Some took up arms, others carried messages, but all carried ghosts. A partisan fighter named Rosa, whose sister had been taken by German troops months earlier, was said to whisper a single name before every ambush, the name of her sister. When the Germans were finally forced out of her region, she disappeared into the forests and was never seen again. The locals called her La Vendetta Muta, the silent revenge. As the Allied advance accelerated, chaos replaced order. German troops retreated north in disarray, burning bridges and towns behind them. In those final weeks, discipline disintegrated entirely. Soldiers acted out of panic, killing civilians who tried to flee, looting homes and assaulting women in what they called farewell visits. To them, Italy was no longer a battlefield. It was a grave they were trying to fill before abandoning it. Some officers shot their own men for refusing to continue. Others drank themselves into oblivion, muttering about ghosts that followed them. One survivor recalled finding a German soldier dead in a barn beside the body of a woman he had taken hostage. Both had bullet wounds, both clutching each other in death. No one ever knew who pulled the trigger first. When the Allies finally entered northern Italy in April 1945, they found not a liberated country, but a wounded one. The German surrender did not erase what had been done. Villages celebrated, yes, but in the shadows, women wept silently for reasons no one dared to ask. Many of them bore children fathered by the occupiers. Some abandoned those infants at churches. Others carried them as silent reminders of their torment. The stigma that followed them was relentless. Neighbors whispered. Husbands refused to return. The same men who had failed to protect them now shamed them for surviving. The psychological aftermath was perhaps the cruelest legacy of all. Italy wanted to heal, to move forward, to rebuild. And in that eagerness, it buried the stories of its women beneath layers of collective denial. The men who had fought were celebrated, the women who had suffered were erased. In schools, the textbooks spoke of battles, not barns. Of heroes, not victims. The silence became national policy. For decades, their pain existed only in unspoken memories, in faces that looked away when asked about the war. But the truth could not stay buried forever. In the 1990s, when historians began uncovering testimonies from survivors, the scale of what had happened emerged piece by piece. It wasn't a few isolated crimes. It was a system of terror. Entire regions had lived under occupation policies that normalized violence against women as both weapon and punishment. The soldiers who carried out those acts were trained not to see their victims as human. And when they lost the war, they left behind not just destruction, but generations of silence. At the heart of it all was a single realization, that the breaking point of war is not when the guns fall silent, but when morality does, when ordinary men stop recognizing the humanity in others, and when victims are forced to live with the knowledge that the world may never believe them. And as the war's final days approached, that collapse of morality reached its most horrifying climax. Because as the Germans prepared their last stand in northern Italy, they carried with them one final plan, an act meant to erase every trace of their crimes before surrender. What they attempted in those final nights would leave scars that Italy still carries in silence to this day. The final months of the war in Italy felt like the closing act of a nightmare that refused to end. By April 1945, the German occupation was collapsing, but its final breaths were filled with vengeance. The SS knew the Allies were days away. Their leaders gave no illusions of victory, only orders to destroy, erase, and retreat. What followed was not war in any traditional sense. It was extermination of evidence. Villages that had already suffered were targeted again, not for strategy but for silence. The Germans understood something the Italians did not yet know, that when truth rises from the ashes, it can condemn the living more harshly than death itself. Across the valleys of Lombardy and the plains of Veneto, German columns withdrew in smoke and fire. Their trucks carried not only soldiers but prisoners, Italian men and women whose existence was a risk. They were the ones who had seen too much, heard too much, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Along the retreat routes, barns became execution sites. Each burning building hid a story the Germans wanted buried forever. The Allies, advancing from the south, reported seeing columns of black smoke in every direction. To them it looked like the last chaotic gestures of a defeated army. But for the villagers who remained, it was the sound of the past being murdered before it could speak. In the town of Rovigo, a warehouse used by the SS as an interrogation post was torched overnight. Locals found the charred remains of 23 women, their hands still bound. Witnesses claimed they saw soldiers laughing as they poured fuel, shouting that no witnesses would live to tell their stories. The official Allied report later called it a scorched earth retreat. That phrase was clinical, detached, like so much of the language used to mask horror. But survivors who hid in nearby fields described something closer to ritual slaughter. One old farmer said that the soldiers were singing as they burned the building, their voices rising above the crackle of flames. They wanted the night to forget their crimes, he said, so they made it louder than memory. In the mountain regions, where partisans had fought bitterly, the retreating Germans left behind mines, booby traps, and empty villages echoing with loss. In Emilia-Romagna, entire communities vanished overnight. The soldiers took the young women first, ostensibly for labor transport. None were seen again. Decades later, Italian researchers uncovered unmarked graves near the Po River. Dozens of skeletons, most female, some with fragments of wire still around their wrists. There were no dog tags, no uniforms, just silence buried under the soil. The soldiers had succeeded in their goal. The evidence had nearly disappeared. But bones have a way of remembering when men choose to forget. The Allies entered the north expecting resistance, but what they found instead was emptiness. Towns stripped of people, animals wandering streets of ruins, rivers thick with ash. When British troops reached Verona, they discovered hastily abandoned German posts, littered with burned files. Thousands of documents were destroyed in a single night. Interrogation reports, prisoner lists, transport records. What couldn't be burned was thrown into rivers. The few surviving pages were singed and water-stained, fragments of an erased reality. One half-burned document, later translated by Allied intelligence, contained the phrase «Endlösung italienische Frage», the final solution to the Italian question. Its meaning remains debated, but its tone was unmistakable. Extermination disguised as order. The soldiers who carried out these purges were themselves unraveling. The once disciplined SS had become a fractured band of men haunted by what they had done. Some shot their own comrades to prevent desertion. Others fled into the forests, stripping off their uniforms and hoping to blend among the civilians they had terrorized. There are reports of German officers ordering executions of their own troops for cowardice. But in truth, they feared their men might confess. The collapse of the Third Reich was not just military. It was moral disintegration. They were no longer an army, but a swarm of fugitives dragging their guilt across the Italian countryside. And yet, amid this collapse, a strange reversal began. As German control crumbled, some of the same Italian collaborators who had enforced their rule turned against them. The fascists of the Salo Republic, desperate to save themselves, began exposing the crimes they had once enabled. They pointed to the Germans, to local commanders, to anyone but themselves. It was a race to survive judgment. They surrendered to Allied units claiming they had been forced to comply with SS orders, but their lies dissolved quickly under the testimony of survivors. In villages like San Martino, women who had been brutalized during the occupation stood before Allied investigators and named the men who had betrayed them. One former Black Brigade officer was recognized by a woman he thought dead. Her voice, shaking but clear, sealed his fate. For the first time, the silence began to break. However, justice was selective, uneven, and slow. The world's attention was fixed on Germany and the horrors discovered in the camps. Italy's smaller tragedies were overshadowed, dismissed as the byproducts of occupation. Trials were held in Rome and Turin, but the focus was on major war criminals, not the nameless soldiers who had scarred countless women across the countryside. Many perpetrators vanished into the fog of post-war Europe, assuming new identities or blending into refugee streams. A few fled north to Austria and Switzerland, protected by networks of former fascists. The survivors who tried to testify were often silenced, not by force but by disbelief. The war was over, officials would say. Let us heal. But how can a nation heal when half its wounds are buried alive? For the women, liberation was not freedom. The stigma of what they had endured became another form of punishment. Some returned to villages that called them traitors. Others bore children conceived in violence, raising them in secret, inventing stories about missing fathers. The church offered them prayers, but not absolution. The state offered medals to partisans, not to victims. Italy's reconstruction was built on forgetting. To rebuild the country, they had to erase the shame, and so the records vanished, the stories faded, and the ghosts were left to wander quietly in black and white photographs. Faces blurred by time, eyes still pleading for recognition. Yet the truth has a persistence stronger than denial. In 1947, an Allied officer stumbled upon a hidden cache of photographs inside a German trunk near Bolzano. The images showed women, Italians, blindfolded, tied to chairs, surrounded by soldiers with cigarettes in their mouths. Some frames captured moments of laughter, others of despair. The officer, horrified, sent them to London for evidence in post-war trials, but they were never used. The photographs were deemed unreliable due to lack of verified location or names. They disappeared into military archives, sealed for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s that a historian uncovered copies in a private collection. By then, almost everyone in those pictures was gone. What makes those final days of the German retreat so haunting is not only the scale of the destruction, but the deliberate effort to hide it. Every burned document, every vanished prisoner, every destroyed village was part of an unspoken operation to cleanse history of guilt. They understood that the world would soon be asking questions. They intended to leave behind no answers. And for a time, they succeeded. The war crimes in Italy never received the same global attention as those in Poland, France, or the East. The victims became ghosts not only of war but of memory itself. But fragments always survive, diaries buried under floorboards, photographs hidden in attics, words carved into the walls of prison cells. Together they tell a single truth, that what happened in Italy was not chaos but order, a cold, systematic attempt to erase the evidence of crimes too great to confess. And in doing so, the perpetrators ensured something far worse, that their victims would remain nameless forever. As the Allies advanced into the Alps and the last German units surrendered, the guns finally fell silent. But silence does not mean peace. The smoke that rose from the valleys carried more than ashes. It carried secrets. Secrets that Italy would spend the next half-century trying not to remember. Because the true war, the war to be believed, had only just begun. And as the files were sealed and the ruins rebuilt, one question still lingered in the quiet streets and churchyards of the north. What happens when the truth is buried deeper than the dead? The answer lay waiting in the decades that followed. when fragments of forgotten testimonies began to surface, and with them, the ghosts of the women who refused to remain silent. What surfaced next would finally expose what the Germans and their collaborators tried so desperately to erase. When the last German columns vanished into the Alps and the Allied flags rose over the ruins, Italy exhaled. But it was not relief. It was the breath of a wounded body that had learned to live with pain. The gunfire had stopped, yet the echoes of what happened lingered in every shattered building, every scarred face, every whisper that dared not become a confession. The women who had survived the occupation emerged into daylight carrying invisible wounds. They were not celebrated like the partisans or honored like the soldiers. They were simply expected to move on, to bury the past beneath silence and survival. But silence has weight, and in the years that followed, that weight would suffocate generations who never truly understood what was lost in those hidden years of war. Post-war Italy rebuilt itself quickly, but not honestly. Streets were repaired, churches restored, factories reopened, but moral ruins were left untouched. The new government, eager to forge unity, refused to divide the nation with accusations. The crimes of the occupiers and their collaborators were locked away, sealed in dusty archives marked classified for national security. Among those sealed documents were reports of mass arrests, missing women, and statements from villagers who spoke of things too horrific to print. Those testimonies were quietly removed from the public record, their pages redacted or burned. It was as if the state itself feared that remembering would make the past real again. The women understood this silence all too well. They had seen their neighbors' indifference, their priests' unease, the way even their own families avoided their eyes. To speak of what had been done to them was to risk being judged, pitied, or shunned. So they learned to disguise their memories in fragments, half-truths and murmured prayers. A woman might say her husband was killed by the Germans, but she would not say how she had survived afterward. Another might speak of being taken to work for the soldiers, but she would never describe what that meant. Generations grew up hearing only fragments of these stories, like pieces of a puzzle deliberately left incomplete. One such fragment surfaced decades later, in the form of a letter found behind a cracked wall in Florence. It was written by a woman named Carmela, dated May 1945, addressed to a friend who never received it. "They burned everything," she wrote. "Not just our homes, but our faces, our names. When they left, they took our truth with them. We are alive, but we are ghosts. That letter was never sent, never signed, but its words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken testimonies. Meanwhile, Italy celebrated liberation. The newspapers printed triumphant headlines: victory, freedom, peace. But for many women, peace was another prison. Some bore children whose fathers wore enemy uniforms. Those children, born of violence, were treated as living reminders of shame. The mothers were called German women, or worse. Some abandoned their infants at convents, unable to bear the stares of neighbors who whispered about sin and disgrace. The war had turned them into victims. Peace turned them into outcasts. As decades passed, the official narrative of World War II in Italy grew cleaner, more heroic. School books spoke of partisan bravery, Allied victory, and the fall of fascism. The occupation was summarized in a few lines, a period of hardship and resistance. The women who had endured the hidden war simply vanished from history's pages. Only in small villages, in churchyards and kitchens, did the memories survive, in quiet conversations between old women whose eyes went distant when the word Germans was spoken. The world outside forgot them, but their silence remembered everything. It was not until the 1990s that the wall of denial began to crack. A historian named Elena Pavesi, researching partisan archives, discovered a sealed box labeled Restricted Civilian Accounts. Inside were over 300 testimonies collected by Allied investigators between 1945 and 1946. Most had never been used in court. The reason was simple. They described atrocities that had no surviving witnesses but the victims themselves. Rape, mutilation, mass killings, details too disturbing for post-war tribunals seeking political stability. Pavesi spent years cross-referencing those accounts with military reports, and what emerged was undeniable. The crimes against Italian women had not been random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, systematic, and widespread, a form of terror meant to control, punish, and erase. One testimony stood out, a survivor from Emilia, who described being held in a barn with 20 other women for 3 nights. She remembered the soldiers' laughter, the songs they sang, the way the moonlight fell through the cracks in the roof as they took turns dragging women outside. "I prayed not to die," she wrote. "Now I pray that I had." Her name was never recorded. She was simply listed as female, age unknown. That anonymity is perhaps the cruelest truth of all, that those who suffered most were never even given names in the official record. When Pavesi published her research, it was met with denial and outrage. Politicians called it revisionist exaggeration. Church leaders urged restraint, warning that old wounds should not be reopened. But wounds that are buried do not heal. They fester. And as survivors began to speak, their stories spread across the country. Elderly women came forward, some for the first time in 50 years, to describe what they had endured. Their testimonies were halting, fragmented, often interrupted by tears, but they shared one common refrain: "We were never asked before." The discovery reignited a national reckoning. Memorials were erected in places where women had been taken, plaques placed on barns that once served as makeshift prisons. Yet even then, many resisted the truth. The idea that the liberators, the Allies, had also committed assaults was too painful to accept. But the archives did not lie. Reports from 1944 and 1945 mentioned incidents of misconduct by Allied troops, particularly colonial units stationed in southern Italy. The women had lived through horror, and when victory came, it offered no sanctuary. For them, the war had no side, only faces in different uniforms. In the end, history's judgment was not about guilt or innocence. It was about forgetting the soldiers who committed. These acts faded into obscurity, most dying without consequence. Their victims carried the burden of silence into old age. But silence is not the absence of truth. It is its final shape. The truth remained, hidden in diaries, in photographs, in the trembling hands of women who had seen what civilization becomes when power is absolute and empathy extinct. And perhaps that is what makes their story so haunting. The war did not simply destroy lives, it rewrote them. It taught entire generations that suffering, if endured by women, was not history but shame, that the worst crimes are not those committed in the dark, but those that the world refuses to see in the light. Today, when historians walk through the valleys and villages once scarred by occupation, they still find remnants, shards of pottery, rusted bullets, children's shoes buried in the dirt. But the most powerful relics are the invisible ones, the memories that refuse to die. Old women still light candles on anniversaries that no one else remembers. They whisper prayers not for revenge but for remembrance, for someone someday to understand what was done to them and why the world turned away, because that is the final truth buried beneath the rubble of Italy's war, that silence is the last weapon of the guilty, and for decades it worked. But now, as the last survivors fade and their voices become echoes, history begins to listen at last. The photographs once hidden in trunks have resurfaced. The names once erased are spoken aloud. The forgotten women, those who were humiliated, violated and erased, are finally returning to the world that denied them, not as victims, but as witnesses. Their faces, black and white, stare out from exhibitions and archives unflinching. Their eyes no longer plead. They accuse. And as we look back into those faces, blurred by time but sharp with truth, we realize something that the soldiers and the silence could never erase, that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit leaves a trace, a whisper that survives the fire, a truth that refuses to stay buried, because in the end, the war may have taken their bodies, their names and their peace, but it could not take the one thing they carried into eternity, the proof that they lived, that they suffered, and that the world once turned its face away. Now the world must look and remember.